Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the 21st Talks podcast. My name is Coleman, and I want to welcome you guys to episode 11, where I got the chance to talk with Dr. Ndidi Nwaneri, who is a researcher at Loyola University into questions of global justice, philosophy, policy, especially African policy, and also existential risk. Really, she is an incredible thinker with a massive breadth of understanding, and we absolutely had a ball talking. I'm super excited to get this conversation out to you guys. Ndidi is an expert in social and political philosophy, political theory, international development, and global justice. Massive breadth, and it was a breath of fresh air to get the chance to talk with her about questions of social justice, global justice, and existential risk. So we spent a lot of time critiquing the contemporary sort of ways that the American academics talk about questions of existential risk from a perspective of someone who went to undergrad outside of the US. And that sort of perspective is one that we need to constantly bring into existential risk discussions, because we are talking about problems that face the world as a whole. So getting the chance to talk to Ndidi was fantastic. It was so much fun to talk with her. A massive honor of mine. And I also am really happy to say that this semester I'll be doing some research with her formally. And this is really just one of many discussions that I hope to bring with Ndidi and, evoking her perspective on these really complex issues with a focus and determination on making sure that the outcome of these global disasters are expressed in equitable ways and in just ways. Because that is one of our defining features as a species, is our ability to approximate justice and try to act in line with that. So this conversation made me feel incredibly hopeful for the future, and we know some of the work that we have to get done now. So thank you guys very much for listening. Please remember to like, rate, and subscribe on whatever platform you're listening or watching this on. We just started our YouTube channel, so make sure to go and subscribe there at 21st Talks on YouTube, where we release weekly videos in addition to these podcasts. It is going to be a really major part of the 21st Talks going forward. So any support on there that you can show us, any love, really goes a long way. And all the love and support you guys have been showing for the podcast so far has meant the world to us. 21st Talks has a team of people. It's not a one-man show. And we have editors, we have copywriters, we have uploaders, we have marketers. Like we have the full gambit. And it really goes a long way to pushing all of us to continue to get these episodes out to you all when you guys show that love and support. So thank you for all of the support so far. And without any further ado, here's today's episode with Dr. Ndidi Nwaneri from Loyola University. And once again, thank you very much to her. And I'm excited to chat with her in the future and very excited to get this one out to you guys. So have a good one. I'll see you guys next week. What are the forces, challenges, and ideas that define the 21st century? Conversations to understand the greatest figures and stories of today to create a better tomorrow. This is the 21st Talks podcast.
I mean, with languages, you're learning them permanently, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then it sounds different depending on. So the idea of you drinking the water of where it come from is more metaphorical than physical, right? It just simply means that an immersion experience, right? There's certain things you cannot learn. I can't learn French in the US, right? You have to have that immersion experience. So you can just pronounce it Nwaneri. Strike out the N, because the N is something an anthropologist told me is a prenasal, Prenasal, pre-nasal N is a prenasal N. So it's like saying mama, with your tongue is on the roof of your mouth. Nah. Like the bony roof of your mouth is it's called a prenasal N. And I think it is unique to certain languages. You don't have the equivalent in English, right? So it'll be very difficult to expect anybody who doesn't have that feature It's like there's a sound in Hindi that
Yeah.
hmm, it's not the same, because the sound, you don't even do it with your tongue, you do it with your throat, the outer part of your throat.
Hmm.
So there are a lot of Nigerians that cannot make the sound, and a lot of people cannot make the n sound. So it's easier to just say Didi. Some people call me the same N that starts my first name, the sound that starts my first name starts my last name. So it's a unique type of N pronunciation. So
Mm.
it's, if it's easier for you, just call me Didi or Nwaneri. People just leave out the N. Now, for instance, my first name, when people say, how do you pronounce your first name? I say to them, it's like saying indeed, right? It's
Hmm.
like saying indeed and putting the I at the end of indeed. Ndidi.
Mm.
Yeah, that's exactly the sound, but not an M version of that, like
Yeah.
but not an M version of that, not a
It.
mama version of that, but a nana
Mm.
version of that. Mm,
Yeah,
nah.
that makes sense because I was thinking of pronouncing it with the instead of it being like an NDD, it was an NDD.
Yes, I
Yeah.
also do Ndidi.
Okay, that's good to know. I
But you see, most people that are not Americans don't really have issues about name pronunciation.
yeah.
It's not, for us, it's not a thing, because we feel that, I mean, I come from a country that speaks 400 languages.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about 400 unique languages, honestly, not dialects. So
Mm.
it's, so going to school in Nigeria, there are people from everywhere. They speak so many languages in just elementary school. So we're very comfortable with bungling people's names and people bungling our names. And
Which
we
I
don't
mean,
have that
Americans are
emotion.
not, which is the
No, no,
interesting.
no.
Yeah.
Well, the thing is, right? Don't get us started. Let's go on to the program. But you have to remember that it's also, it's a version of, to me, it's, you're not going to get it right. I mean,
Mm.
and you just respect that process, right? If you learn the language for 10 years, you probably get it right, but you
Hmm.
can't, not in 3 seconds. Come on. It's nice to ask. I understand where the sentiment is coming from, but nah,
Hmm.
you won't. Anybody that tells you that yes, you got it right was just being polite. It's not. Seriously, I mean, how many even French names like Michelle?
Yeah.
Somebody has to tell you that it's Michelle, not Michele,
Mm.
right?
Hmm.
So yeah, I don't think it's that big a deal. I think we can seek respect in other avenues. That's what I think, but that's
And
not.
I think it's interesting because a lot of times it's almost like a perceived like othering that happens that makes a lot of Americans, especially people who mean really well, incredibly nervous when they go to
Mm,
mispronounce a name.
mm.
My
But they
mom's
are
name,
going to. Yeah, your mom's name is what?
my mom's name is Marit, right? But it's spelled in a weird French way, so it looks like Merit.
Ah,
And every time she gets it, as like a a middle-aged white woman in the United States, if someone mispronounces it, it's like, oh, sorry, Marit, you know. Whereas a friend of
mm,
mine named with the name Kwame, he anytime his name is mispronounced, at least when it's from a person on like our like primarily like liberal
mm.
like university campus, like the people get so much more uncomfortable because of the perceived sense that they're going to offend, right?
It's a
um
subtext. It's a social
exactly.
subtext.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's a social subtext, and it's not that big a deal.
Hmm.
Sometimes when you over apologize for something, everybody's like, okay, what are you hiding? You know what I mean? Sometimes
Yeah.
it's best to be like, okay, yeah, dude, I'm not from your country. Like, I haven't even heard this. Okay, calm down. Have a glass of wine. It's okay. It's not that big a deal, you know? So, but that will be in an ideal society. So I understand where the sentiment is coming from. It's like,
Yeah.
look, this society disrespects you. And I
Hmm.
don't want to be an instance of that disrespect. So I'm going to overcompensate. Do you
Yeah,
understand? But
exactly.
you have to be careful you don't fall into a spiral where you're overcompensating. Then the person is like, why are you overcompensating? If I was from Connecticut, would you overcompensate? Oh, it's not that. Then it's all back and forth, back and forth. I don't think it's that big a
Yeah.
deal. I don't think it's that big a deal because you could fall into a spiral, right?
Yeah, and I suppose that a lot of like like I'm someone who's like assuredly on the left, right? Um, however, there's still a lot of critiques of it within my own sort of like political views, right? And a big part of it is I don't like people viewing an apology that's based out of someone being afraid of something is less valuable in my opinion than someone apologizing out of something because they want to treat the person like a human being, right?
Gotcha.
And I think a lot of contemporary politics right now is focused. I'm not on
Mm,
the full spectrum, and I recognize that the
mm,
American full spectrum is like
mm,
slanted right heavily, right?
mm-hmm.
um but given the contemporary American sort of political framework, um, it seems like a lot of American sort of like ethics politics right now, especially on university campuses, is about not being offensive, whereas it could be, I think that can kind of obscure the actual goal, I think,
Mm-hmm.
of a lot of left wing, which is liberation, right? It's hard to
Mm,
liberate if you're being afraid of offending. And obviously the application that sort of offensive awareness is
mm,
applied primarily to groups of people who are facing like systematic oppression.
mm,
Um, but it's difficult to view everyone in the economic system, or it's difficult to view economic oppression as another leading factor
yeah.
when there's this like general aura and this general sense of other routes of oppression being
Mm-hmm.
the primary focus, right? So it'd be
Mm-hmm.
interesting to hear your take on that. Also, I'd like to point out the interview has already started. That was we'll find a jump in somewhere. So thank you for being here.
You're welcome. It's my utmost pleasure.
But yeah, what do you take that to be?
What?
Specifically the view that seems like a lot of sort of political ethics is based out of, like, at least in the contemporary American left, is
Mm.
based out of like a fear and not necessarily a desire for liberation, if that makes sense.
Yes, it makes a lot of sense. I completely understand what you're saying, and
Mhm.
this is the subject of entire course units and entire libraries could be stuff could be written because there's so many ways of looking at this.
Mm.
But the uncharitable side of me, so I'm going to start with the uncharitable. The uncharitable interpretation is the fear is a fear of genuine equality,
Yeah.
and the expression is an expression of of that internal fear of genuine equality. So I'm terrified that genuine equality could occur, but
Mm.
it's important that I don't show that internal fear. So to cover that up, I overcompensate by coming across as being terrified of not offending.
Oh, that's
Because
interesting.
if I really want to towards equality, it won't matter to me whether or not I offend in the short term, I think.
Exactly.
But then again, who the shoe fits, right? I'm not in that position. I cannot interpret mindsets, but the way I see it is somebody said, don't be nice to me, don't be courteous to me, just give me my due.
Hmm.
It's not important that you're polite. Give me my due. Do you understand? Whatever my due is, give it to me. So
Hmm.
if my due is discourtesy, give me discourtesy. If my due, whatever my due is, give it to me. In other words, be neutral. Be neutral, objective, straight in the middle towards me. You don't have to compensate for anything, and you don't have to create any problems. Don't try to solve the problem. Don't create new ones. Just stick to your lane, and we'll all be fine.
That seems so, and perhaps the reason why there's that kind of sort of like reactionary sort of protectiveness of like over courtesy, right? Where you do treat people differently when you perceive them to be the other, right? But it's maybe that's based off of an inability for us to actually like have objective politics that we actually apply to people like fairly. I've been learning a lot about Confucianism, as well as like different sort of like ethical approaches to global risk recently. And I was talking with this really great researcher from Wuhan a few days ago. And she was talking about how the sort of like Confucius notion of like moral circles has a significantly different sort of like story given to morality than like utilitarianism or contemporary sort of like European or American routes of like ethics, right? Um, However, that being said, the big point there was that in Confucianism, like it recognizes that we treat people differently based off their like relationship to us, you know. So like if my mom got like hurt or something, I would be there a little bit quicker than if like a friend of mine who I haven't talked to in a few months got hurt, right? And it's based off of these sort of like stories of how we tell ourselves what we tell ourselves our like relations to other people are, that we interact with the world. And then like as you get like larger and larger, more abstracted away from your like day-to-day life, and get to like the nation state level, or like the global world level, no wonder like it's a lot easier for people to interact in the world normally, when really what could, you know, make sure that people, you know, on the other side of their nation aren't starving to death is them like volunteering, right? So there's like this like interesting moral disconnect that happens, I think, that also applies to politics here, is that like maybe a part of that question of why people sometimes can overcorrect, is based in a recognition on some level that it's better to overcorrect than to continue just mistreating, you know, or mistreating in the
I
sense of
see.
like not
I
giving enough
understand
due,
where
because
you're
we can't
coming
pay the
from.
due. And
I
I hope that
see.
this is incorrect. So I hope that there's something
Yes.
here that we can dive
No,
into.
I
But
completely understand where you're coming from, and there's an extent to which I agree with you, right? So the idea of concentric circles, it is
exactly.
natural, right? So, I mean, even this conversation I'm having with you, in 3 months' time, that's the whole object of networking. Your classmate calls me up, I'll be like, wait, who's this guy? Who's John? But if it's Coleman, I'm like, oh yeah, Coleman, yeah, that guy. You know what I mean? That's life, right?
Yeah.
So I understand where you're coming from. But you see, the idea of social justice is not the responsibility. It is only indirectly the responsibility of the individual. At the end of the day, it is the responsibility of the state. The tragedy of social injustice is when an institution has a particular perspective.
Okay.
You understand where I'm coming from? So it's
Yes.
not really, it's not about Coleman or Ndidi. Of course, I'm going to treat my person better, right? But one of the things that the state does, or the state is supposed to do, is to ensure that I do not use my connection to Coleman and the fact that we're both in existential risk research, and I use it to treat John badly, right?
Yeah.
So the state is the mediator. The state is like, wait, what are your employment rules? How are you zoning your neighborhood? Are you picking up all the Colemans? Yeah, all the people that live in your suburb are existential risk researchers because you want to hang out with them in the same bar. No, we're not going to let that happen. That is the role the state plays, right? So it is not the part of the individual to ensure that social injustice does not happen. In fact, the individual is not the individual's problem. In fact, the state is supposed to check the individual. And for the sake of taking care of my own interests, which might be challenged tomorrow, when Coleman decides that I cannot live in his neighborhood, it is my interest in my interest to make sure that the institution checks both me, the existential risk researcher that wants to get the same people into her neighborhood, and Coleman, who might end up one day deciding that no, they can't live in my neighborhood because of how she looks. So we want institutions that make sure that there's a neutrality, at least at the level of the state. That's what we're working towards. That's the ideal. Now, for the individual to now say to me that the state has been unjust to my type, therefore they're shifting and feeling uncomfortable, that makes me uncomfortable. Because it is not while you're sitting in front of me that you correct a social injustice. No, it is at the level of the state. I'm not even supposed to know about it. It's not your problem. I don't care. It's irrelevant. I mean, saying to me, oh, social injustice sitting in front of me, no, get involved in politics and make sure the institutions are neutral. And if they're not, fight for its neutrality. Because you know what? Today it's gender, tomorrow it's race, next tomorrow is ageism, then it is the rights of children. It could be anything.
Yeah.
So that is why it's a bit weird, right? When the individual is sitting in front of me and trying to compensate for what social systems are doing against me. That is not the time or the place. It's weird, right?
Yeah.
It's weird because I'm thinking to myself, wait, why are you taking on this? It's not your responsibility.
And I think that a lot of the kind of like apology, right, is from that basis. So that makes a lot of sense, because I feel like American, and it'd be interesting to hear what your experience in like other areas, and sort of like yeah, just other areas of the world, with not super American like politics and cultures. I've been
Mm,
immersed in it, most
mm,
of my life, right? So it's hard to see me it's hard to see where the Kool-Aid like ends,
mm.
and like and where like nature or like politics, or like a more universal form of
So
politics.
there are lots of people in Nigeria that will probably not sit down in the same, um, that will not eat with me in the same room. The reason they
Whoa.
will not eat with me is either because I'm in a predominantly Islamic community, or because I'm a woman. How dare I sit down with men to eat?
Oh wow.
Or, they don't like my politics because I protect gay rights, or something, or they
Mhm.
feel that, oh, we're Nigerians, we hate we hate people that are transsexual, want to know what your gender is, and as far as we're concerned, or maybe I want gay people to be able to get married, or maybe I've decided that, well, I don't care what your religion is, it's all made up anyway, stuff like that. So there are lots of reasons why people that look exactly like me will choose
Mhm.
not to hang out with me, will choose not to have their children hang out with me, etc.,
Yeah.
etc. There are all sorts of issues like that, right?
Mhm.
So it is not the prioritizing of the person that looks like me, right? Is
Mhm.
not unique to the US.
Mm.
Is not, right? That's number one. Racism is not unique to the US. So
Mhm.
people that have the same skin color tend to hang out together. So
Yeah.
there's a colored category in South Africa, then there's a black category, then there's a white category. More often than not, they have their own little subcultures, totally
Mhm.
entitled. I think they're totally, anybody's entitled to hang out with anybody else, right?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
truth be told, I would rather hang out with certain people that are not necessarily like me in terms of
Mhm.
how they look, but it would be nice to have something to talk about, listen to the same type of music, attend the
Yeah.
same kinds of functions, or have the kind of education that we can hold, well, the same level intellectually.
Mhm.
And there's nothing wrong with that, right?
Yeah.
You don't want to be the spoke, that weirdo in the middle, right? Now, if somebody opens their doors to you, it'll be nice to experience something different, but some people travel, some people don't. Some people mix, some people don't.
Mm.
For me, I feel that if I decide, for instance, that I want to live with a particular type of people, it is my choice, right? And then part of the Kool-Aid that I've noticed in the US is this presumption that ethnic minorities want to hang out with the mainstream. Not necessarily.
Yeah, I've
What
seen
are
that
they
a
going to
lot.
talk about? Like what really? I mean, let's think about, let's be objective about it. Like, it's not the same type of music. It's not you can go around saying superior, inferior music, whatever, fine print. The important thing is that when I want to knock my shoes off after a hard day's work, do I want to hang out with this type of people? Not necessarily. The
Yeah.
presumption that everybody's struggling to hang out with everybody else, no, it's not necessarily the case, right?
Hmm.
So
Especially from like working class environments. Like I
yeah.
know people with some really iffy politics who don't believe that neutral system or fighting for that neutral system as much,
Mm.
um, who have the most diverse set of friends and individuals that they spend time with. That's not the point here, right? It sounds like what the
That's
point is how you feed into the larger, how you
yeah.
help create the larger sort of neutral system.
And then yeah, the thing is, the pressures that people are put under.
Yeah.
You're right, there is a Kool-Aid that is being guzzled, right? But the content
Mm,
of the Kool-Aid depends on the environment. But the truth of the matter is that
yeah.
maybe, how they say, what's that saying? There's this really cheeky saying about how the lady protests too much, something else. The lady doth protest. There's this terminology.
I've never heard that. I like that.
Okay,
That's
so
interesting.
it's a joke. It's
Hmm.
British literature where, Victorian England, where it's you know it's a caricature of this woman who is protesting too much, you know,
Mm-hmm.
who is just standing in the street corner and telling everybody how she really doesn't like the attentions of men. And, you know, that left to her, she'll be a nun, you know, left to her, she won't even look in, you know, and everybody's like, okay, why are you telling us about this? Like, okay, like, why is it so important that you convince us, you know?
Yeah.
And then you can see the hypocrisy within the protest. You understand?
Absolutely.
So why are you going on and telling me about how you're this and you're that? Just get on with your life. It really becomes a drag after a while, you know, like just get on with it. It's okay. It's not, the society is not your responsibility, and you don't need to address anything in front of me. So that's, you know, well, that's just my perspective.
Can we talk a little bit more specifically about global catastrophic risk? I know all
Yes,
this is
please.
really tangential with it because, of course, it feeds into your approach to it.
Mm.
But how do you see global catastrophic risk and existential risk as a whole connecting to these questions of social justice and like sort of the neutral state?
So, how did we get to where we are? Most
Mm-hmm.
of the risks we're talking about. So, what is a catastrophic risk? At the end of the day, it boils down to that which is made by persons, or that
Mm-hmm.
which is that. The question is, it could be a risk that is created by scientific artifacts, right? Technological objects, and I'm using the term very generally, including artificial intelligence, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the second part, which is a risk that can occur. For instance, a tsunami. Let's presume that a tsunami was not somehow, it's not, there isn't any human participation in its creation. However, where social justice enters into all of this, it is is in our response to it. So it is,
Mm-hmm.
on the one hand, it could be created by us, where it becomes a social justice issue in its
Mm-hmm.
creation and its deployment, again, in our response to it. But even when it's not created by persons, where persons come into the equation is when how do we respond to it? What is available for us to respond to it? So now I'm going to say this 3 times.
Okay.
The coronavirus was not necessarily made by persons. The coronavirus was not necessarily made by persons. The coronavirus was not necessarily made by persons. I'm saying it 3 times because I just want to use this as an example and I don't want to be misunderstood. Now, what I'm
Perfect.
trying to say here is this. What if, for instance, by some conspiracy theory, right?
Yeah.
It was, the coronavirus was actually either error or terror. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe somebody actually made it. The
Yeah.
question now becomes, it's not about who made or who did not make. The injustice or justice becomes our response to it, right?
Yeah.
That's where the social injustice comes up, right? Or social
Mm-hmm.
justice comes up. What systems do you have in place to be able to manage a situation like this, even if it is created? Now, if it is not created, again, the question is, we have a calamity, how do we respond to it, right? So the ability to respond to anything becomes a social justice issue because people are making decisions that are affecting other people. If you already have dysfunction in your society, how you respond to everything is going to follow the lines of those dysfunctions. So let us say you are in the habit of cheating women, treating women badly. Your
Mm-hmm.
society is just overly abusive towards women. Who is going
Yeah.
to suffer the most when a problem comes in? Of course, it's going to be the women because
Yeah.
there will be buffers, right? If you already have a racial disparity problem, a problem comes in, gee whiz, New York, it was mostly minorities that died, right?
Yep.
If you already, so it's your structure. Everything you bring in will follow a structure.
And that structure is the sort of political systems and sort of all
Yes,
wrapped up
it
in the
is your
economic
social
system. It's the
systems.
cultural,
Yes,
the social
yes.
systems. Yeah.
Mhm.
Um,
So
so yeah.
sorry. I'm sorry. Before you continue, I want to point out something.
Mm-hmm.
In
Please.
Nigeria, right?
Uh-huh.
In Nigeria, when coronavirus first hit, nobody knew it was airborne. Who died the most? The rich people in their air-conditioned homes. You
Because
never
it's
saw them on the
wow.
streets. They all went into hiding. Well, not really hiding. Everybody was social distancing because nobody knew what was going on as of March. It's a
Yeah.
novel virus. So all the people that were saying that World Health Organization isn't telling us what to do, they don't know anything. Well, nobody knew anything,
Oh
right?
wow.
Well,
That's
so
interesting.
So it comes into Nigeria. Nigeria is a tropical country. If you have
Mhm.
two $10 to rub together, you probably have air conditioning. So
Yeah.
you locked yourself in. Domestic helps were going out and in. They moved around because they had to make money, right? They had to eat. I
Mm.
mean, they can't be without work. He's a rich guy in his nice air-conditioned penthouse that can afford to stay indoors for 2 years because he has savings, right? But his domestic either has to stay or has to go and come. But this guy didn't know that the whole thing was airborne, and we noticed that it was mostly the elites that were dying in Nigeria, right? Now, in New York, who was the people? So everybody was locked down because the society is richer, right?
Mm.
But there were still people who had to go back and forth. And it's always the lower echelons of society that go
Yeah.
back and forth. Now, look at the interesting thing that happened in Nigeria. The poor people cannot afford air conditioning. Everybody sleeps with their windows open because it's in the tropics. Yep. Yeah. Then,
Wow.
then the rich people lock themselves in air conditioning, and a lot of that, at least initially, it was mostly senators. The president's chief of staff died. Senators were dying. Celebrities were dying. Well, because they were rich enough to lock themselves into air-conditioned rooms.
And get
But the
more
poor people
exposed. Oh wow.
came home because they had maybe 2 kids, 4 kids, two-bedroom apartment, tropics. The windows were permanently open, and nobody knew what was going on.
Mm.
But you see, that comes with another side. That's why I love social justice theory and political theory. Another thing that happened that was unanticipated is that the poor people in Nigeria now began to doubt the efficacy of the stories because nobody they knew was dying. It was only the rich guys that were dying. They're like, wait, what's going on here? So, then why are you guys locking us up? Why are we not going out and finding our daily bread? We can't be locked up. And it just became this chaos. Now, the opposite was happening in New York because it was
Mm.
people that were moving around, that were contracting it the more. And who are the people moving around? Okay, socioeconomic injustice.
Mm.
The browner you are, the lower you are in the economic ladder.
Mhm.
So who were the service workers? Who were picking up work? Coronavirus or no coronavirus, right? And
Yeah.
who was chilling at home? The college professors, they were just chilling at home and wore their masks and had their everything delivered to their doorsteps. Who was
Mm.
doing the delivering? Those were there. So
Yep.
it's very difficult. Social justice theories, it's very, very difficult for you to use a theory that does not, you can't apply what happened to New York to Iowa, for instance. You can't do Iowa in Mississippi. You can't do Mississippi in Nigeria. You can't do Nigeria in Ghana. It doesn't work that way. You have to know what you're doing.
So it comes down to sort of an anthropological, sort of cultural, political like view and
Yes.
landscape of the actual place and people you're talking about,
Yes. That is
because
very
that
important.
system,
Mhm.
that political, cultural, ideological system is built up by people. That's what makes it neutral or not neutral.
Yes.
Or more so, I guess it's like there can be people who aren't, because people aren't going to be neutral, as we discussed earlier.
Mhm.
Um, but you can have a system that limits and benefits behavior that is neutral. So
Mhm.
there is still, the system is still an entity, but it is still created by the people and their
Oh,
sort of
yes.
conscious mindsets. That's fascinating. I had no idea about the differing like responses and reactions.
Oh,
That's
just
fascinating.
to mess with you a bit more, and
Yeah,
then we're
please
going to
do.
stop talking about
No,
coronavirus.
I love this. I love getting my like my preconceived notions getting completely like erased.
So think about this. On
Hmm.
the continent of Africa, there are a lot of differences,
Yeah.
right? There are big cities, there are slums, there are mega cities, 20 million people. Cairo is huge, Lagos is huge, right?
Yeah.
Most of the capital cities very congested with a lot of traffic. You have billionaires and paupers, you have slums and gated estates, everything all mixed up together.
Hmm.
But in a lot of the communities, in a lot of so-called traditional societies, the primary caregivers are always the women, right?
Yeah.
So what happens is that somebody falls sick. Oh yeah, don't you have a sister? No, no sister. Don't you have a female cousin? Do you really expect your sons to be doing this, right? There's that notion, right? So when you're going to say, for instance, you bring sorry, the virus, you bring the what's it called? A vaccine. And then you come to a place like the US and you're like, oh, it's the healthcare professionals that are going to get it first. Are you going to do the same thing on the continent? Who are you going to give the vaccines first? Who are the primary caregivers? When we had the Ebola problem, even the first Ebola patient that we could trace in Sierra Leone, what happened? Somebody's husband died of Ebola. Widowhood rights exposed the wife, the widow to the dead husband's body because of traditional rights.
Mm-hmm.
And that was how we got patient A in Sierra Leone, whose relative came from the US and was on his way to a conference in Nigeria, swung by his sister's husband's burial, caught Ebola, hopped in a plane, came to Nigeria, right?
Yeah.
And that was where he was contained, but like 12 people around him died. Fortunately, we could contain it, right?
Yeah.
Now, if you have customs where the women are the frontline medical providers, particularly when you don't have a formal setting, when you get this vaccine, are you going to break so are you going to say, oh, healthcare providers, the way it is defined in another society? Are you really going to achieve your ends when you bring it to a society where even if the patient is in the hospital, the closest female relative is yanked out of whatever she's doing and it's like, yeah, you provide care? Or a more unfortunate woman. It's always a woman, right?
Yeah.
So it's very interesting when, that's why I find social justice theories really interesting and social justice questions very interesting because it's very different and you really want to go into what you're talking about. You can't just send a text. It doesn't work that way. You're going to get it wrong, right?
Yeah. And God knows I will get it wrong.
No, but I mean, even me talking with so much authority, I mean, every situation is different, right?
Oh, absolutely. But you recognize that, which is the nuanced thing to do, I feel like.
So let's not dwell on this. Let's go into existential crisis. Let's stop talking
we
about.
Can wrap it up. We can wrap it up with some existential crisis later. But yeah, I agree. Let's keep digging. It's fun.
So what's your next question?
So my next question is specifically about so I think we sorted out the connection between X risk and questions of social justice. Because I know that you're the person who helped bring social justice to existential risk discussions, which is fantastic. Can I get a little bit better of a sense where your specific academic training is? But this is the big thing, is of course like philosophy is my home field. It's what got me into global risk. It's my bread and butter, right? Specifically continental. How's philosophy connect to global catastrophic risk? We're in a very heavily technocratic field, where technology worship is a very predominant thing. But where do philosophers fit into the questions of global catastrophic risk?
So I can only tell you about my own trajectory.
Yeah, I'd love to
my
hear.
background is from a degree in economics. I went into development economics back in Nigeria. I worked in the NGO sector, then I worked in public policy, then I decided to study public policy. So I got my master's in public policy from George Washington University, and Washington, D.C., the development capital of the world, exposed me to, so it's kind of like studying philosophy. Of course, if you're studying philosophy as a Black person, there's no way you won't be nudged in the direction of critical race theory, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So
yeah.
It's like default. Everybody nudges you into the room. You're like, no, I came here to do something else. No, but yeah, you're the right color. But jokes apart, I find it interesting because it's also part of the study of the self, right?
Exactly.
Myself, critical race theory, I find interesting for a lot of reasons. And so not to rib it. But so in my own case, studying public policy and philosophy, social and political philosophy, at the graduate level, that was my public policy strain. In DC, of course, it's exposed a lot of questions. So a developing country's public policy, what is it going to be? It's going to be development related. And so I was in that whole mix, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you see, at the end of the process, I had more questions than answers. So I decided that I was going to do a PhD in social and political philosophy, because it was just the question of what are we even doing? What's the thinking behind social justice? Behind no social policy, public policy, international development policy. What are the theories that undergird the action?
That's
Right?
so cool.
So
Yeah.
I decided to do a PhD in social and political philosophy. Now, in the course of doing that, I narrowed down to global justice,
Mm.
fairness, justice. How do we allocate resources? Is it the best way? And is it about resources or is it about justice? So, what came out in my PhD research is that at the end of the day, social global institutions are the vehicles of delivering, allocating global resources. And those
Mm.
global institutions are not just institutions, they're actually set up and run, managed, and perpetuated by persons. So if an institution does something wrong, it is a person that made a decision that did something wrong. No matter how complicated it is, at the end of the day, it is human action that carries institutions.
Mm. And that,
So,
oh, sorry, go on.
yes, you were going to ask.
Is that the connection to philosophy then? I feel like philosophy is, it exists in this really weird area. Bertrand Russell talks about in his introduction to his like history of like Western philosophy, right? But he talks about how theology is on one side, then science is on the other, right? And theology answers questions of human life and existence with a certain a certain ego of itself,
Mm-hmm,
right? This
mm-hmm.
confidence, right? Whereas science has a skepticism, in part born from philosophy, but a skepticism that says we're going to suggest hypotheses and then try to follow those to their conclusion, test them, observe them, define an objective. But there's still this area in between of questions that you can't have, formalized research questions within a scientific model for. What is consciousness? What is good? What is the good life? What does it mean for me to have a responsibility in life as an individual? My connection to society, all these questions brought up as far back from, like Plato and like pre-Socratics, or like cool, like Hindu philosophy.
So in my own case,
So
right,
yeah.
I like what you're pointing out.
Uh-huh.
In my own case, it wasn't really, so philosophy for me was to
Yeah,
an
I'd love to hear
extent
what that is.
instrumental.
Okay.
What philosophy did for me is that it broke the mold. I needed a course where I could break the mold and put
Yes.
it back
Okay.
together again. And breaking that mold, for me, right, part of the process of breaking the mold was break the mold and build it back up again. And so everybody thinks of philosophy as this, there's this royalty that used to refer to the men in waiting as men, gray, old gray men or something, right? This whole tradition. No, I don't see philosophy as that. I see philosophy for me provided the tools to use to question existing institutions.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
granted me the freedom to imagine a world where there was no World Bank. So the World Bank has a start date and it's going to end one day, right? It's not an essential, it's not a necessary component of allocating resources. It is existing today. Now, is it serving its function today? You'll be surprised at how shocked people's pupils dilate when you say to them, it's not necessary for the World Bank, IFC, IMF to exist. Is that the best we can do? So the freedom, that kind of freedom of thought, there are very few courses that can give you the ability, the mental tools to imagine a world that is so far removed to what exists. And the ability to imagine such a world is a precondition to being a social justice person, because you have to be able to imagine a better world, a different world, right?
Yeah.
There's something called tyranny of the given, which is because it's there, you don't even have the moral courage to imagine a world without it.
That's interesting.
So for social justice people, people who are fighting for a better world, it is because they are able to visualize a better world. Then they work towards it. Now, if you're fixated and molded and tied into what is, you can't go beyond that. So I saw philosophy as very liberating. It was that field where nobody gave me chapter and verse. Everything could be questioned. Therefore, I questioned everything.
Yep.
So that's how I ended up in philosophy from international development.
Yeah, and I remember talking with you after the Caesar conference for a little while, and I remember one of the really interesting takeaways from that conversation I had, one of the many, was that you were applying philosophy to other sort of like I believe it was like an economic and / public policy setting in a way that hadn't necessarily been applied recently or before, and I think that interdisciplinary approaches inform my approach to global catastrophic risk, right? So since our discussion back then, a little bit over 2 months ago, maybe a month and a half, anyways, nonetheless, since that discussion, a lot of the global catastrophic risk questions and discussions I've held not just on this podcast, but also in the reading groups I run on it, in this thing called MOC that I run, all those discussions have this basic locus now of trying to connect it to not only just philosophy, but economic, public policy, political discussions, all these different fields. And I think the goal there is to recognize that people have the broadband to talk about a wide variety of these different fields in a way that breaks out from the traditional, standard sort of disciplinary model, right? So it's like if someone is like an economist, there's like a running joke where it's like, if someone's an economist, then like every problem seems like an economic problem, right? Whereas if someone is like an engineering focused individual, every problem's an engineering problem. And it's absolutely true. And I think that's absolutely true in existential risk. I'm sure the solutions that you see people sort of like bringing to the table, it always reflects their home field. They're always playing for their home field, even if they're not aware of that. But
in consulting, this is referred to as solving yourself into the problem, right? So someone says bring a solution, and you embed yourself. But that is the truth. That's all you know. So you're right. When you talk to a finance person about domestic issues, they'll say to you, if you just get the interest rates down, life will be. He doesn't tell you about elementary school education. He doesn't tell you about agriculture. He goes, once the interest rates are, or he will tell you about, once people have access, and you're looking at this guy like, really, dude, like, really? But I guess we're all like that to an extent,
Oh, absolutely. But we can look beyond it, not just with like, philosophy, for example, which I know has been the case for you to a large extent, as well as like for me and my personal interest and love for it. But we can also kind of look past solving ourselves into the problem by connecting with people, right? So it's like this podcast, as well as my primary, like my main love in life is conversation. I just like having conversations with people from like as many places as I can possibly talk to them from, as many perspectives or whatever, right? Because every person I talk to is going to have their own sort of sways, dispositions, and affects, right? And based off of that, I can kind of like during that conversation recognize that, participate in their outlook on life, and bring it as a bit of my perspective, right? So a big part of this podcast is how can we bring all those perspectives to the table for global catastrophic risk, because we're dealing with questions of actual human extinction, and if not human extinction, our moral extinction by not equitably distributing the survival, which I know we're seeing in climate change. And I think that that's, as well as other like coronavirus. So I think one of my questions for you in social justice, and this question of justice, global risk, do you see us surviving this century with our morality intact, in the sense of like having equitable survival and not just have the the elites of the elites surviving? But do you see us doing that with nation states intact, with our current nation state model? Do we need a more humanitarian outlook on life and how political institutions work, or can we do it with the UK, the US, all these sort of like whether like the Egyptian government, like all these different sort of like individual kind of competing, jostling parties?
So this is a very, very deep question, and it just provides all sorts of tentacles. There's a question of there's a question of capitalism, which
Yeah.
nobody wants to talk about in the US. The
Nope.
question is, are we able to deliver on this vehicle, or are we holding up to it? Are we holding on to it like a religion? From my position, from where I'm sitting, I'm very, very open about it.
Yeah, same
Yes,
here.
let us continue with the capitalism, but you know what? Let's not kid ourselves. We're not going to deliver on welfare. Welfare will keep dropping, right?
Yeah.
Because that is just the nature of the beast. That's how it works. Okay.
Mhm.
Now, having said that, um, so I'm not going to go into capitalism and all of the challenges because it just raises all sorts of questions. Socialism has
Yeah.
become a bad word. It's all people are talking about. People say capitalism. No, wait, capitalism versus democracy. And everyone's like, what? No, wait, it's socialism and democracy or some, like apples and oranges. Like, dude, you're not comparing the same thing. One is an economic system, one is a political system. But that is the extent of our ignorance, right? So I'm not going to go into it because it just raises people's hackles. I really don't care. I mean, carry on with what you're doing, but don't not sit in front of me and tell
Mm.
me that we're on the same page because we care about human beings. If you're a
Mm.
capitalist, you care about growth. And you're going to
Mhm.
use every means to achieve growth. And you're going to delude yourself before you go to bed
Yeah.
that growth means welfare. And you and I know that that is not true. But it's
Yeah.
okay. Let us just agree to disagree and move on. The question of the nation state. The nation state is a very recent development in human history. It is designed not to keep people in, but to keep people out.
Mm.
And the out group becomes the group that we're justified in exploiting.
Mm.
We can go, make enemies of them, steal everything they have, become rich, congratulate ourselves. That's the way it works,
And then
right?
put it in a museum, then refuse to give it back,
It's
like the
okay.
UK is
But the
doing.
thing is, right? But the thing is, it's okay. Do you understand?
Hmm.
If might is right, it's fine.
Yeah, they
You don't
morally
have to
justify it.
co-opt me. It's not necessary. Do you understand? Do
Yeah.
your thing. You don't need me, right? But you see, the
Mhm.
guilt makes people who already have this mindset want to convert me. They're always harassing me, like, yeah, Ndidi, we're okay, aren't we? I'm like, dude, okay, you're strong, you're big, you stole it all.
Yeah.
Well done. Can I go on to my life now? No, 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 no. You have to tell me that I'm okay. I'm like, you can't have it both ways. You can't steal all my loot and tell me that. Like, it's okay. Why don't you just take the money and go? But you see, it is this notion, this understanding, though we end up denying it. You see, equality is our inherent, equality and justice, I
Mm.
think, is inbuilt in us. The notion of equality, the notion of justice, the notion of fairness.
Wow. That's a big
Oh,
claim. I
yes,
like
it is.
that.
Think about it. Think about 6-year-old twins
Mm.
fighting over ice cream. Well, she got to pick the flavor the last time. I think it's only fair that I pick it this time. Oh, she gets to sweep the room all the time. Why can't I get to sweep the room? Why does she get that? Like, yeah, you gave it to her the last time. You like her more than you've seen kids do that. It's inherent. Justice is
Mm.
inherent. Fairness is inherent. But you see, we become sneakier the older we get. Like, yeah, there's a way I can convince Coleman that, I can just take everything in his room and convince him that I'm doing him a favor.
Mm.
Sometimes it works.
By delivering me democracy.
Yeah, I mean, and and I'm like, you know what? Sometimes I just find it exhausting.
Hmm.
You
Yeah.
know, the ideology that you develop to justify your atrocities, right? So,
Yeah.
question, going back to the question, our current systems is what has put us are what has put us into this problem, right?
Hmm.
Now the question is, how do we come out of it, and are we interested in coming out of it? I have very bad news from where I'm sitting.
Hmm.
No, we're not interested. We're not interested in justice. I don't think as people we're interested in justice.
Mm.
And I'm not going to go into it in this podcast, but
Hmm.
I have a theory that we the economist, right?
Hmm.
The psycho we haven't figured it out. We got it wrong. We keep thinking that human beings are greedy. The
Hmm.
capitalist, he wants more. He
Hmm.
wants to earn more money. No. I think there's something else that is way more important to persons. It's not gain, it's not greed. It is power over the other. It's far more important than material gain. That is why, because you see, if we had a perfectly just world, we'll have 10 times more resources than we have right now. If we had a perfectly just world, we'd have 10 times more resources than we have now. But you see, instead of having 100 resources, the world is ready to have 10 resources. Because you see, those 10 resources are shared, is top heavy. Do you understand? The people that have 80% of those resources would rather the world has 10 resources and they keep 80% of it than for the world to have 100 resources shared evenly.
I see what you mean. Yeah.
Even if they end up getting more of that 100, so long as even if they get 20, 20, 20, and everybody gets 20 evenly, no, they don't want that world. They would rather have a world where we have only 10 resources and they keep 80 and everybody else is struggling with 20.
Because it seems like the way that a lot of our structures value things, like in a sort of like sort of market value for things, is based off of that question of scarcity. And that question of scarcity is inherently predicated off the concept of mismatches in amounts people have. That makes so much sense. So that's not just a question of money and getting as much as you can. It's making sure that your opponent, the other, is put down
way
enough.
Less. Oh yeah, totally.
Wow.
So we haven't that is something that I'm still developing it.
Yeah.
But we have to recognize that is what is important. What is important is power differential, not absolute access.
Yes. Yeah. This is fascinating. Which, I mean, like, it's so tricky because even you and I in this discussion, this might be a sort of brief, sort of meta tangent, right? I love getting meta. It's my favorite thing. But you and I are talking about these things using ideas from a wide variety of experiences, right? Whether it's academic, lived, whatever, right? But all those notions that we use, all the sort of explanations, the metaphors, the terminology, all that stuff that we use to sort of try to sort of build a self-conception, to bring some Hegel into a self-conception of ourselves inside the system, as well as the system's conception of itself. All that is predicated off of work in part done by other people at times, right? People who have drinking various different types of the Kool-Aid, so it's difficult for us to see beyond that in a meaningful way. And these sort of conversations where we're like coming up against that, right? And I don't exactly know what it is, but you get the sense that there's kind of like a epistemological barrier here for us to accept our insufficiencies in understanding the world, the limits of our own ability to actually understand and consciously perceive things, not just based off the metaphors we use, but also just based off of experiences and all these other things. Because if global risks are the product of the entire system, right, that means that there's something that people across the board aren't seeing. So the question is, how do we see those things, right, while also being a member within inside that system? We have to find ways to, allow our heads to see above the kind of the waves.
In the Frankfurt School, it's called immanent critique, which is the ability to critique a system that you're actively upholding and living within.
I like
so if
that.
I have a problem, so I'm using an Apple laptop.
Yeah.
How is it made, right? So both of us are totally against that kind of thing, but we're using it. But you see, it's I guess in a lot of so first of all, one of the first things I learned in philosophy is the limitations of what you're even capable of knowing, right?
Yeah.
That's one. The second thing is that you have to also understand that I like what you're saying about ideology. I like what you're saying about being enmeshed within an ideology that limits how you even understand your environment, right?
Yeah.
And the struggle and the battle to move beyond where you are the ideology, and be able to perceive things in a different way. Now, some within an ideology, people will say to you that they have a bird's eye view, which is false, totally false. Because how did you climb up there? You climbed up on your ideology. You're still standing because that it provides you tools of the ability to see, right?
Yeah.
So that is a problem. Immanent critique is a problem. A lot of people fail with immanent critique. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, is so how do you question that which you're living within and which you have identified as a problem or as a challenge? How do you critique it without being a hypocrite? Right? So honestly, I don't know. It's an ongoing, it's a constant negotiation. That is why to me, right, I don't approve, I don't like feminist philosophy or critical race theory because I happen to be female gendered or I happen to have black skin. That is not why. It is because these are the people that are not very, they're not very aggressive in standing on podiums and telling everybody that they figured it out.
Yeah.
Because nobody has. Nobody has figured it out.
And they're the people who have that conception of self with that sort of inbuilt recognition of ignorance.
Well, but you see, they've been on the other side, right? They have
Exactly. Yeah.
watched ignorance play out as knowledge.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
And they've lived
when
it.
yeah,
Yeah.
right. So
Yeah.
when they finally, their voice is going to be a bit more hesitant, not as
Yes.
self-assured, right?
Yeah.
Because they're like, wait, we just watched this person make a fool of himself for 1,000 years, asserting that he's a rational individual that gets it without realizing that he's product of a culture.
So there's this connection between this kind of I know like was it Socrates talks about how he's like a fool, right? And there's in contemporary continental philosophy there's an idea of the idiot being something to strive to be, the person who asks questions that they should feel they have an answer to, right? And there's some really remarkable stuff happening there, but I think it definitely speaks to this question. Sorry, I just bumped my mic. Speaks to this question of how confident people are in the stories that they tell themselves about the world, right? And the stories that they tell other people. Because, for example, myself as a young academic, I'm rewarded the more ardently I pursue a specific perspective in most fields except philosophy, right? But then reality, the question there is like, well, as as I get into masters and then sort of PhD programs, I will then be rewarded for being able to ask questions. And that process of asking questions is predicated off my ability to recognize what I don't realize, right? But in every other sphere of human life, you're rewarded the more confident that you tell the stories. And there's this really weird thing for me where it's I'm working on like a long writing project right now, the set of ideas to help us tackle problems in the 21st century. And like the second idea is this notion of recognizing yourself as dualistic, right? Having, that the sort of like Buddhist view of yourself as the thing experiencing life, but then also the persona, the mask that you wear when you're participating in the world. If you can balance a conception of both, you're able to recognize that persona is much more malleable than you tell yourself, right? And I recognize the deaths of despair that come with depression, anxiety, and all the sort of internal limitations that we place on it, or not that we place on ourselves, that we find ourselves in, right? Because of neurochemistry as well as narratives, right? And it's difficult when you're in that to recognize the malleability of the story of who Coleman is, right? Or who Ndidi is, right? And it creates a situation where with global catastrophic risks, this sort of self-conception is critical to get right. And the current one that society provides us with is leaning into that persona while not also recognizing what you actually are underneath, that conscious experience. Because people who lean into that persona and see it as themselves, I see Coleman Snell, the podcast, the student, the young man or whatever, as like me, myself, as what I am in essence. The people who see that more are able to proliferate within the system better, right? So the ideology selects for that perspective, but that also allows for a propagation of ignorance, which is directly counter to questions of justice and questions to refine sort of hesitancy that is needed when talking with any authority. So I think that it's interesting that's like these like feminists as well as sort of like sort of radical thoughts on these questions, whether it's the pedagogy of the oppressed or what have you, these approaches have built into them a reward mechanism for people who are able to check themselves, you know,
Let's see.
because it seems like that is kind of it's something that human society struggles with through and throughout, you know, is rewarding people who are uber confident of themselves and the stories they tell about the world. And that doesn't fly anymore, or
Well,
shouldn't.
I think it will always fly. It will
Yeah.
always fly
Yeah.
because one of the features of persons is
Mhm.
what I uncharitably describe as intellectual laziness and moral laziness. There is an intellectual laziness,
Yeah.
but you could interpret it as that. But the truth of the
Mhm.
matter is that, especially modern life, is so complex and so exhausting. It's very
Absolutely.
difficult, and thinking requires leisure, right?
Oh, yeah, that's where the word, yeah, that's the sort of that's the language roots in Greek. Is it means leisure. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, if you're kept busy enough,
Mhm.
through trying to survive, or through either through trying to survive or through, what do you call it, mate? Either through trying to survive or through bread and circuses,
Mm.
where the government gives you just enough food. You have your welfare card and you have your sports, right?
Mhm.
You have your television. At the end of the day, people are really too distracted to do what you and I are doing, right?
Yeah.
Besides, what's the point? If you're not an academic, what really is the point,
Mhm.
right? It's using up bandwidth for nothing. So there's an extent to which it is structured to be like this. That is very, very true.
Yeah.
And they don't even know how to, right? So I'm using concepts like immanent critique, and I'm using concepts like, oh, you can critique, you can actually be aware of the fact that you're using an Apple laptop
Mhm.
while at the same time questioning how Apple laptops are produced. A lot of
Mhm.
people will consider that a very, very deep contradiction. The
Yeah.
fact of purchasing a laptop makes you morally inadequate or incompetent, or morally, you can't have moral justification for questioning how it is
Mhm.
produced because you're already implicated in its production.
I think that the way that ideological systems deal with hypocrisy is really, really, I think it's telling to the self-imposed sort of mechanism of
Mm.
successful ideologies. And this pulls some from like sort of like memetics and stuff, which like kind of debunked like approaches philosophy or whatever. However, I think that ideas propagate in societies when they are pragmatic or you like have a utilitarian edge, not when they're just, not when they're fair, but when they have a
Mm.
pragmatic edge. That's when ideas can sort of like take hold of a society, right?
Let's see.
Which is a very stark view. That's probably one of my most depressing views, I have to say. um but I think there's this thing that I've noticed from, and be interesting to ask you about because I've been working on some research relating to it, is this question of how hypocrisy is handled in societies. Because it seems like time and time again, hypocrisy and contradiction deeply
Mm.
hated. In the U.S., for example, after it was some conservative news host. He like said something about getting all the addicts in the country and sending them down the river, tying them to a log and saying, I mean, he was suggesting we kill our addicts, right? And then a few years later, he came out as being addicted to opioids, right? And everyone jumped on it. I did. I thought it was like, I was like, wow, yeah, look at this like major case of contradiction. But as thinkers like Jonathan Haidt have pointed out, is like contradiction is deeply hated, like not ubiquitously in all society, but in a very, very large portion of them. Especially in contemporary American society, which is the one I know best, of course, or perhaps worse, depending on how, you know, self-conception works. But I think that there's this mechanism in societies where hypocrisy has to be negative, has to be seen as a negative thing, because when you accept contradictions, you're able to dive deeper into your self-contradictory nature, which I believe is a foundational aspect of the human experience, right? Is contradiction. So stories that tell us not to look at the contradiction as a source of new truth, but as something to be shunned, to move away from, it
Mm.
stops that process of digging. that process of unearthing was actually there. And I think I kind of agree with Nietzsche when he says that the human mind is like a series of caves on top of caves. You can dive into them, but you will go insane if you spend too much time down there. You have to go back to the light of the surface, right? And the question is, you get into this cave system, maybe a few feet in at first and a little bit further and a little further. The first thing that you see is contradiction. That's why I think dualism is a really useful way of understanding ourselves, right? That dualistic sense of being two things at once. Because otherwise it's difficult to balance the contradictory forces that our sort of psychosomatic structure presents us with. Then in our society, that creates a situation where it's difficult to talk strongly about anything, if you're riddled with contradiction. So we have to have a new approach to contradiction, I think.
So your questions open up massive cans of worms.
I'm sure
That if we start pulling at that thread, we'll probably be here for a long time.
Don't worry, we can do another episode sometime. I'm totally down for that if you are. So
but as we were talking, I was thinking about the concept of psychic unity, right? So for the sake of psychic unity, so if you're going to be oppressive, right, you're going to tell yourself stories to manage the contradiction of your abuse. So everybody wants to be a just person, a fair person. Everybody wants to be seen as, yeah, I might not be an angel, but I'm certainly not a monster, right?
Exactly.
Even while you're being a monster.
Yeah.
So collectively and individually, to justify being a monster, you tell yourself all sorts of stories. So let me give you an example of the kind of stories we tell. And again, I'm going to use Nigeria as an example because you are not invested in Nigeria, you'll be able to look at it and you'll get what I'm saying. So in Nigeria is a very patriarchal society where the heterosexuality is one. There's gay. How do you say? Um, there's this thing about not liking gay people. What's it called?
Homophobia.
Homophobia. There's quite a bit of homophobia. There's traditional man-woman relations. It's patriarchal. Men in a lot of instances, men inherit, the women do the cooking. Just think about it. Like, of course, that is changing in the metropolis a lot, but there's still, it's still that kind of society. Now, so that means that typically the men are a bit more in such societies within the heterosexual communities. There's a way the game is done, right? Mating works in a certain way. The women are more passive, the men are a bit more aggressive because you see, they have the power, society permits them. They can walk up to a woman and talk to the woman, but a woman cannot talk up to a man, cannot walk up to a man because she'll be seen as brazen. Okay? Now that's how society functions. The mating rules, the mating dance works like that. The woman is kind of a bit more demure, the man is a bit more aggressive, and it just works like that. Everybody's happy. However, domestic abuse, sexual molestation and abuse of domestic help, how is it accommodated? All of a sudden, the news on the street is that domestic helps are promiscuous. That's the story. That all these women, all these domestic helps, this is the story among the women that own the homes. So think about suburban women, the Nigerian equivalent.
Yeah.
So the gist is that all those domestic helps, you have to be careful. They're just sexual predators. So I asked somebody that, okay, so this story has been made up to justify the fact that your husbands and your sons abuse these domestic helps, right?
Yeah, it's post-rationalization.
Precisely. So you find that and I keep people is a word on the street, and I keep asking people, how come it is only within this subset of female domestic helps in Nigeria that all of a sudden the social rules of sex is reversed?
Yeah.
It's now within this subset, the women are aggressive. No, you are trying to deny the fact that this woman will probably be sexually molested in your home. So you're going to have this alibi in place in the event that there's sexual harassment. Then you can be like, well, we all know that they're loose. I mean, they're predators. But
Mm.
outside of your home, the women are not predators. The men are predators. But once it's inside your home, you have your story prepared. So you
Yeah.
find and that is because these women that own the homes, the suburban women in Nigeria, they need psychic unity. If
Mm.
they admit that a woman has been molested in their homes, then they need to start questioning the men in their homes, maybe their husbands. And the minute
Mm.
they start doing that, their social standing they're threatening it, their economic standing is threatened,
Mm.
their their stability, their emotional stability, their happiness, their whatever it is they build there. Think about the the all these housewife sitcoms, right? Once you remove that, what is that woman going to do? Well, if somebody is going to be sacrificed, she's going to sacrifice domestic help, right?
Mm.
In a society where the men are powerful economically, politically, socially, maritally, the men have most of the power. So they're not
Mm.
going to relinquish their position because that's how they get social protection, by being Mrs. Something, right?
Exactly.
And if
Yeah.
somebody is going to be sacrificed, it won't be them. It will be. So they prepare their story ahead of time and then they employ the house help.
So the stories they use to justify things, even if they're contradictory, are meant to
Of
cover up.
evidence.
Yeah, yeah, just directly irrespective of like evidence that like
Mm-hmm.
to people on the outside would be like, oh yeah, obviously that's what's happening here. Obviously it's a case
Yeah.
of sexual
So
harassment and
my
not,
my my sleeves
help
are
deviancy.
dirty. My sleeves are dirty, not because I
Yeah.
didn't give them soap, but because they're just dirty. So you don't
Yeah.
question their welfare. You're like,
Hmm.
yeah, they tend not to take. No, they're working 12-hour days, and you don't give them soap, and they can't buy soap. So
Yeah.
yeah, they were born grubby, right? So the pregnant
Oh
house
my
help
gosh,
that you
yeah.
throw out of your house in Nigeria, oh well, she's promiscuous. She just walks up to men and hits on them, and she hit on my husband. No, she didn't hit
Mm.
on your husband. She was sexually molested. But you have your
Yeah.
story, so
And it also allows the people within the like I kind of think that like within like it the corresponding thing here is like in the US economic system, for example, it's like the housewife in this example is like the middle class, right? In the US, right? In the sense that like they are participating in self-exploitation in a way, but the stories that they tell themselves
yes.
is to not justify that, or is to justify that
Oh yeah.
self-exploitation, right? So the
Yes.
entrepreneurial class is doing entrepreneurship under the guise of it being liberating, when in fact it's anything but. And I think it's the same thing in this case. And of course I'm
Yes.
not a Nigerian housewife, so it's difficult for me
it's
experience,
it's it's
but
it's the story of psychic unity. You
exactly.
really have to tell yourself those stories, or else you will end up looking at yourself in the mirror. And once you
Yeah.
look at yourself in the mirror, you'll probably burst into tears. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because it's like, wait, am I this person? So you have to constantly be in denial of being this person. So it's called psychic unity, where
Yeah.
you'll find that the people that spread the biggest stories are usually the socially powerful. They're
Mhm.
the ones that have the stories to tell about everybody else. It's never
Mm.
about them and their abuse, economic abuse, political abuse. No, no, no,
Yeah.
no. They have this nicely wrapped story for their own psychic unity more than any other thing. And if you mess
Mhm.
with that story, you become their enemy.
Yeah, it's the Koch brothers in the U.S. enforcing the story that immigrants are scary and we should ignore them, but also we should secretly have open borders so we can exploit them. It's this weird line where it's a two-faced persona,
Uh-huh.
um, that has no level of self-conception, has no level of actually, like you said, looking at self in the mirror.
Mm-hmm.
And I think my question is, as sort of a final, not something to be answered, but just something for us to, I know that I'll take into, the rest of my
Mm-hmm.
day and hopefully the next week or so of reading for
Mm-hmm.
myself, is if we're going to survive global catastrophic risks facing our world down, not just literally, but also with our humanity intact in the sense of having it be equitable survival, right?
Mm-hmm.
Equitable welfare. If we're going to do that, how does this question of looking in the mirror fit into that? How does self-conception, the heady way of saying one's understanding of oneself and what they're
Mm-hmm.
doing, and this question of how we justify the bad things that we do, the contradictions, how we overlook the contradiction, all of that, our understanding of self, how does that fit into that question of global catastrophic risk justice? because I think it is a very, very intimate question to ask
Mm,
people. You know, it's difficult to do in a public forum, but it's something
mm,
that's worth doing in a public forum. And a lot of the work that I'm doing with meaning-oriented communities and the rest of the 21st Talks brand overall is we're trying to find a way to show people, especially people from, you know, I come from a working class background. That's my experience that I know. I probably hark on it a little bit too much. But we're trying to kind of flip the script and find a way to make working on global catastrophic risks not like accessible because it, you know, but more so giving people a reason to actually look on that. And I believe that the way we can do that is through showing people how meaningful the career can, how meaningful work in global risk can be, how much good you can actually do. But that good first requires you to have some connection to yourself that goes against the dominant story, which is you as an individual can't do anything, or you as a working class
mm,
individual, you know, you're lesser, you're not good, your parents didn't work hard enough, you're not working hard enough, you should
mm,
succeed economically before you try to change the world. That sort of
mm,
mentality that stifles work we can do. So that
mm.
question of self-conception feeds directly into that, and you know, that's what
Into
I'm
that,
passionate
right?
about.
But
Yeah.
is it not all about values,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. Yeah.
What do we value, right? Who is
Mm,
entitled to speak? Who
mm,
is entitled to have knowledge, right? I don't think there's anything we're doing in the academic circle that cannot be understood by everybody else.
absolutely.
However, if it is so at the level of the environment, at the level of pollution, at the level of how are we eating and how are we distributing, what
Mm,
does it mean for every single toy in your house to carry the stamp of made in China? What does that mean? Literally. Like,
mm,
so there's a way you can phrase the question and frame the question that it ceases to be so abstract. If you ask everybody, where did the jobs go? Who decided for the jobs to go anywhere? Right? When did they go anywhere? So you see, I like multidisciplinary work because when did they go anywhere is time, history. Who made the decision for them to go somewhere? It's politics. Why did they go? Economics, philosophy, right? Why do we feel comfortable? How do the leaders feel comfortable with the fact that as the jobs are going, we're getting less jobs and the tax base here is reducing? What is the pay of who is benefiting? That
mm,
becomes again social psychology question, maybe a question of anthropology.
mm,
So imagine if you wrote a pamphlet that each section was addressed by somebody from a different field, right?
mm.
And you distributed this pamphlet, and that just gives understanding, because the only reason why people can look me in the eye in the US and say to me, oh, there's certain things we can do and bring back jobs from China is coming from a position of utter ignorance. Because the jobs in China are not coming back. The steel industry isn't coming back. It's just too
Yeah.
expensive.
Yeah.
Now, the question is, again, are you willing to forfeit half of your income so that you will have full employment by bringing back the steel industry and the steel becomes 3 times as expensive?
Mm,
Do you understand? Such trade-offs, are you willing to make it? Because that's how you lost out in the first place. So the seriousness of intent and sincerity of purpose of the academic environment is something that we should take into consideration. But I think the academic environment, the trade-off of people like you and me, when
mm,
we're dealing with blue collar people,
mm,
is superiority of knowledge. We want to convince ourselves that,
mm.
and I'm talking about ourselves as a class,
Yeah.
right? As a
Yeah.
group. We want to convince ourselves that this thing we have attained, this room that we've been let into, makes us special. So we don't want to demystify our knowledge, because if we demystify the knowledge, we'll be able to get into conversation with our communities. I don't think there's anything we're discussing that is too complex for people to
Mm,
understand. No, there isn't. Now, the question of existential risk, hmm, it is a global question. It's a global problem. It is a problem that is almost universal, because if the earth goes, we're all gone.
mm,
So you see, the people that recycle out of habit will have a different attitude towards recycling. In fact, they will demand more of it. They will want zero emissions if they knew the full story. And I
Yeah.
believe that we
Yeah.
can tell the full story. We can. It doesn't have to be done in such exotic, expensive language or complex language. We can have what is a floating piece of plastic and its implications. I don't think it's rocket science. It's not that complex. But it's just that we don't want to tell the story because one, we don't actually, to an extent, is because we don't have the resources, we don't
Mhm.
have the money, we don't have the time, and we don't have the moral interest, really. But I think it can be done. And if we're committed to doing it, we can communicate the urgency of the situation.
And I think that that's what we want to do, and we want to get more people involved in that fight. Is to tell a better story of what's actually going on. You know, not just with epidemics, not just with climate change, not just with soil erosion, but all of the other global catastrophic risks facing us down, and aligning our institutions with the goal of spreading, better stories about what's going on is the number one thing I think is, what might
But
pull us away
you
from the
know where
tide.
the challenge
Brink.
where the challenge will arise is from capital and growth,
Yeah, I
right?
believe so.
Why would I want to expend resources in that direction, particularly if at the end of the day, every every single person is into global warming? We're going to shut down a lot of factories and people will lose money. And if growth
Yeah.
is a religion, even on the part of the state, then you have a circular problematic problem.
And it also ties to the question of power differentials, right? So if people are
Yes.
okay with having 10 instead of 100, if, for them it's 10 to 1 with their opponent, but if they had 100, it'd be 100 to 100, right? With the question of climate change, is no wonder people in incredibly elite positions are okay with it happening because
Mm,
they recognize
mm,
A, their material circumstances will probably be okay as long as
mm,
there's not a revolution, but they've stemmed off
mhm.
radicalism, for most of history. Um, and then there's also the other question of, well, if there's less in the world, I can still find a way to leverage the power differential to still be on the
Yes,
throne.
yes, there's that. You're right.
And which I think that question that you are exploring is really, really pertinent to the field of global risk, but also just, the future course of humanity, right? And what life in the 21st century will become, which I think made this conversation um, a fantastically optimal discussion for the 21st talks.
Mm.
I'll go ahead and transition to some last questions we have here because holy crap, we filled the time up well. Um, so let me go ahead and find some of the closing questions that I try to ask all of my guests. But I guess the first one is what recommendations do you have for people who are getting into the field of global risk? Many of our listeners are new to the field, so it may be one of their first introductions to questions surrounding philosophy, inequality, and global risk.
Mm.
But what recommendations do you have for a young person passionate about a disaster who wants to get more involved?
Well, it depends on, they have to decide first of all what direction they're coming at it from. I came at it
Mm,
from the perspective of social justice,
hmm.
global justice, and global equity. How does global equity relate to global existential risks, right?
Mm,
So some people come at it through all sorts of directions. There are all sorts of sub directions, right?
yeah,
Decide how you want to enter into the field, and once you've made that decision, then you read up as much as possible about that. It's a new field. So, as far as philosophy
yeah.
goes, it's 30 years old, and that is new, which is really weird. So, it's a 30-year-old field. So, it's a new field. So, people are just becoming aware of
Yeah,
global existential risk. So,
still
it's
some beautiful founding effect too.
yes,
Lots of great
it's
opportunities.
so they should like any other field, just know how you want to approach it. At the end of the day, it might not even be existential risk research that you end up doing, right?
Absolutely.
I didn't even know that this field existed while I was studying philosophy. So basically, what I studied was international development in
Hmm.
a department of philosophy, all the nuances. Then I came
Oh, that's
across, yeah,
fascinating.
that's what I did
Wait, which
fundamentally.
university was that at then?
Loyola University in
Okay,
Chicago.
gotcha.
So I went to a philosophy department and I just did as I pleased.
Mm,
And I saw philosophy as provided me with tools to think
Yeah.
through issues, right? And that is what, in my own case, that's what I did. And then the question of equity and existential risk came up, and, you know, or global equity. So it depends on how you want to approach it, as I said earlier.
Hmm.
And it's just read, 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 and just get your hands dirty. Read the articles, you know, listen to the podcast, look at all the people that are involved in the field, and
Hmm.
you will find your niche, right? At the end
Absolutely.
of the day, but it doesn't matter what you're doing. I have one final piece of advice.
Yeah, please.
Life is hard enough. Please do your passion. Do
Yeah.
your passion. If you're not doing your passion, you are enduring life. You're just suffering through it. Do your passion and it's just easier, right? So,
Mm.
yes, you might be interested in existential risk research, but from there, you might end up doing community organizing. Look at the distance between international development and rural development, where it started from um, e- um, um, economic development as an area of study, or development economics, and then I end up in existential risk research, right?
Yeah.
But it's, you know, I can tell you the story, I can tell you the trajectory, I can tell you how each block connects with the block that came before it. So there's nothing artificial or constructed about it. It was just a flow of where's my interest going, right?
Organic. Yeah.
So I do things like I do things, for instance, like international development and the use of technology and development in Africa, cell phones, bank transfers. How is it affected? What does it mean to drop that into a developing society? Is it
Mm.
helping or is it harming? Is it following old patterns? Is it worsening inequality or reducing inequality? I do things like that because I'm interested in technology and development. So it makes sense to do in existential risk and um, global equity. It's all part of this hodgepodge of things that I'm interested in. So it's to have the enough courage. So you could look at, for instance, in philosophy, for instance, there's this big freedom, right? I could decide to combine the philosophy of food with the philosophy of clothes, right? Philosophy of colors, you know, how do I aesthetics? What's the connection between philosophy of food? How do I look at food? What is the I'm sure you've heard about this book, Herbs, Guns, Germs, and
Oh
Steel.
yeah, yeah, by Jerry Diamond. Yeah.
Yes, there's that book, and then there's the Omnivore's Dilemma. Omnivore's Dilemma.
That's
It's
cool.
and this is a book that was, I think it came out like maybe 15 years ago. There are
Mhm.
all sorts of combinations that could be made, right? What I will advise anybody listening is do not be afraid of the combinations. Believe me, if it makes sense in your head, you're going to find a place to locate it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it has to logically hold together in your brain.
Mm.
Then you make it work outside. So you don't take things from outside in. You want to hold it together in your head. If you feel there's a connection, make the connection, read about it. If there's no connection, create it and then put it out there.
Yeah. Yeah. That's fascinating. That really closely matches my experience to date with it. That process of organically building a sort of a web of
Yeah.
interconnected ideas. That's
Yes.
wonderful.
And it's
Yeah.
yours. It's yours. It's unique to you.
Mm.
If you I there's something called follow the leader. That
Hmm.
never ends well.
Nope.
It never ends well. When you don't have enough guts to push your own ideas, it never ends well.
And I
And you
think
will
the
never
thing
have a
is
passion for others.
that in like
Yeah.
in fields, right, traditionally like mentorship is something that I love the idea, but good mentorship is not, hey, let's copy, like let's have me become a copy of you, you know.
Mm-mm.
A good mentor is going to foster the mentee to find their own path, right, based off of the mentor's lessons and
Mm-hmm.
understandings, right.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
um and I think that kind of like perspective is precisely optimal for global catastrophic risk discussions,
Mm.
because we can't go off of the old hegemony. Like
No.
we cannot at this point afford to do that. If you're someone who hopes to see equitable distribution of survival and flourishing in the next 100 years, you
Mm.
can't. We have to be willing. And I don't think the solution is breaking down all the systems. I don't think that's the
Mm-mm.
only. I think the solution is learning a synthetic approach, a Hegelian approach of taking what is and combining it to create something new. And we
That's
have to
true.
do that both in our personal process, right,
Mm-hmm.
which I feel like you're talking about, as well as sort of the global institutions we try to
That's
create.
true.
We have to
That
do
is very
both.
true.
But the thing is, and this is one of my favorite things about the philosophy of global catastrophic risk, that process, your inside matches the external, right? So
Mm.
it's the same
That's
process
true.
of synthesis on both
Mm-hmm.
levels, right? And there's not really a difference between internal and external in a
Mm-hmm.
lot of really philosophical ways. However, there's still that same mechanism of synthesis. So I really appreciate what you're saying about
Thank
um
you.
yeah. It will be something that I keep in mind, and I know a few of our listeners
Mm-hmm.
certainly will. Then our last question, which we gotta we gotta finish off with a really positive one. Are you hopeful for our species survival, whatever that means to you? Are you
um,
hopeful that we'll get to the end of this century without bombing ourselves into oblivion?
I feel that we've been bred. We have this tendency to breed self-interest and selfishness into ourselves, and we
Mm,
palm it off as how we are. I don't think we were born. I don't think we're made selfish. I think we're made just and fair, and we just breed self-interest into ourselves. But you see, that self-interest could turn out to be useful
mm,
because even if it's the elites trying to escape off into some kind of pod where they float off, people do not willingly destroy themselves. So the decision makers will not willingly destroy themselves. I don't think equitable survival, we've ever had it. I don't think we've ever had equitable survival.
yeah.
I don't think we're going to have it. But the question now is, it's just like with every state, every nation state that makes it, it's always a bunch of leaders who could be exploitative, but who decide to either take the exploitation outside of their shores and within their shores, right? Inside, they're not exploitative, but they take the exploitation outside to benefit the majority back home, right?
Mm,
So, so I don't think we're going to willingly walk into extinction. No, we're
mm.
not. But the question is, will the survival be equitable? Highly unlikely. I don't think so. I don't think we're that generous yet,
It's like
right?
Nwaneri'ss question of error versus intentional.
Hmm. Having said that, there's also something to be said for the people who feel that, who are so easily led into division. The bottom 50%, the bottom 30%, the bottom 80%, whatever the
Mm,
bottom that bottom is, they really have to step up their game because they're going to be the
yeah.
first to go. That's the truth, right? So they have to find a way to become knowledgeable and to fight back. Because I think one
Yeah.
thing the last 300 years has shown us is that the people that make money are not about to prioritize the people at the bottom. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
So if you want to, so, and then there's something I'm working on as well. The question of what exactly is an existential crisis? If my village becomes blows up, that is an existential crisis because I'm done, right? Can we define existential crisis as at levels?
Mm,
Or do we have to reconceptualize the whole notion of existential crisis and extinction, right? So there are certain communities that have become extinct. What
mm.
did they not have? Whatever it is they had, there was one thing they did not have. And what they did not have was capital. Because if you have capital, you will survive.
Yeah, it's material. Yeah, by nature.
It's
Yeah.
resources, right?
Mm.
So the it's early days yet. There's a lot of work to be done. Yes, I feel that the species will survive, but I don't know if we are able to achieve equitable survival.
Well, I certainly know that there's going to be a point in the future, and this will be some undisclosed moment 40 years from now or 50 years from now or whenever, when we look back and go, okay, what did I make of my life, right? That question that everyone talks about.
Hmm.
um I think that what we want to do, what we want to strive for, is be able to provide people with the answer to that, where they can actually say, oh, I got involved. I got involved before climate change became the thing defining our, our day. It's like I got involved before before the drought started, even though they've definitely already started. But being able to look back and say, I tried, I resisted. And I think that story is something that have you ever read any Albert Camus, the wonderful French existentialist?
Yes.
I
Was that his famous book,
the
The Myth
the
of Sisyphus?
Yes, yeah. I'm actually reading The Myth of Sisyphus right now. My brother is not a fan of it, so he gave me his copy, which I was super good. But his book, The Plague, which sold out this year due to COVID, there's this idea from it that I pull from him, MOC, as well as 21st Talks as a whole, which is this idea that if you're resisting against something, in that case, metaphor for totalitarianism, but if you're resisting against something, that isn't just something to do, it is the thing to do, right? And we might not have an objective purpose, but if something is bad, if there's a plight going on in the world and you can resist against it, and you do resist against that, that is a personal voyage you can go on, that has an empowerment, so even if you resist against climate change, right? Even let's say in meaning orientation uses the individual orientation approach to it, where we say that like we want to get people to reorient a part of their life behind a global problem that they see, right, that they feel, and we have different routes of getting people to the realization, the ideas, and like the actual material means to do that. But the central goal is to get that reorientation happen. But one of the number one reasons why people don't, apart from not seeing the problems around them, but the other big one is that they feel like they can't have an impact for whatever reason, right? And one of those reasons oftentimes as well, or the logical conclusion of that to a lot of people is, well, if I can't have an impact, why should I do it? Right? If I can't solve climate change, why should I try to dedicate myself to solving climate change? It's I'm participating in a game that I know I'm going to lose. But what MOC is trying to do is say, hey, actually, from these ideas from Albert Camus, of you can struggle against it meaningfully. Like if we were being occupied by Nazi Germany and we were both French citizens, or French people, right? Even if we couldn't hold off the Nazis totally, just you and I or whatever, our involvement in the resistance would still be valuable.
That's true. As a matter of principle.
As a matter of principle, absolutely. And I think that that's a perspective we need in global risk. We're saying don't get into this to solve climate change. Have that aim, but realize at your heart that you're not trying to necessarily solve climate change, or you can try to solve climate change, but even if you don't meet that, you're still doing something deeply, profoundly meaningful. Deeply
I
rewarding for
see. I
yourself.
understand where you're coming from. So it's not about the end, it's about the means, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
it's
because
about
the
the
means are the
means.
end in that regard, right?
The means is the end.
Yeah.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Besides that, what exactly is the point? Because at the end of the day, we
Mm.
spend a few decades if we're lucky and we're out,
Yeah, absolutely.
right?
And I want to be able to
So,
spend the last few years of that decade with a nice glass of scotch, looking over some beautiful mountainside and being like, I did something, even if it's
excellent.
even if it's tiny,
I
I want to feel
see.
okay with that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That makes sense. But for me, right,
Mm.
I understand what you're saying and I agree with you. It's the way to be.
Yeah.
I think for me, injustice, right, unfairness and injustice, it
Mm.
just goes against something. I don't know what it is, but it just ruins my day. Just thinking about injustice, it just spoils, like it's not even lack that is my problem. It's just the fact that
Yeah.
Coleman is living his life in such a way
Mm.
that I can't live my life.
Absolutely.
You understand? There's just something, I don't know how I'm constituted, but it bothers me. I
Yeah.
can't walk away from it, right?
Mm.
So, so for me, it's really not about the environment per se, though the environment is part of that, existential risk is part of that, existential crisis is part of that, or the potentials of that. But my issue is that nobody has the right, nobody is justified to live their life in a manner that inhibits Coleman's ability to fully express himself. Now, Coleman could be in a situation where, because it's raining, he cannot leave his studio for the next 2 days. There's this
Mm.
torrential rain. I won't say a word, but my issue is if he can't leave his studio because for 30 minutes because somebody parked their car across his door. So for 30 minutes injustice, I will go all the way to the Supreme Court for. I have a problem with that. But if Coleman, because of the rain, he can't leave, I'll be like, oh, tough luck, dude, but if there's now a problem with the construction person that built where you are, who could have put in two doors, or somebody stole the money to build, whatever that could have relieved you, that's a different story. So my thing is that I have it as a matter of principle, I have a problem with unfairness. Fairness for me is a goal in itself. It doesn't have to, for me, it's just a goal. It's something that we should pursue. So in that sense, I'm right on the side of, that doesn't mean I agree with him totally and completely, but I'm on the side of roles. I feel that justice is fairness and we should pursue it, right? Fairness is a goal, is an objective, is a regulative principle, and it is something we should just go for. And for me, the 2 4-year-olds that are squabbling over how much time each person gets to sit on something, for me, that is how the human being is constructed, and we should honor that.
And we can honor that by resisting against the presentations of, perhaps you don't really have a choice to resist against it, because it infuriates you any instance you see of it, which as in it should, right? But we can resist against the constant onslaught of and unfairness that our society is built upon.
Yes.
But that's not something that you can go into with the goal of eradicating all unfairness. You have to realize it's a cooperative thing between you and other people. And I think getting people on board that fight is one of the most rewarding things we can do, because there's a difference between teaching, giving someone a fish, right, and teaching them how to fish, right? I think at this stage of global catastrophic risk, as well as questions of global justice, teaching people how to fish is one of the most important things we can do as a field, is lay those seeds down and find novel approaches and provide the material means for people to do those approaches, like meaning-oriented communities, right? Or like accessible books or accessible lectures or whatever. And I want to thank you so much for sharing your approach with me, because I honestly feel like we have a very, to take a synthetic approach to it, right? Is we're both, the conscious sort of locus of what we justify that we're doing, and sort of like how we justify it to ourselves, differ, right? They differ relative to our experiences, but at the end of the day, we are talking about the same thing, which is what is fair, what is good, right? In our mind. So I want to recognize that I am, we're in a fight together for that fairness. And for that.
Yes, that's
so I just true. And I think that's something that is wonderful to feel, because it's one thing to resist against, it's one thing to resist against the tide of plight, but it's another thing to do that with some good friends. So I appreciate you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate being able to share this thoughts with you. Thank you so much, and well done. Great work.
Thank you so much. I mean, that genuinely means so much to me. I'm sure we'll have you on in the future.
Thank you so much. Anytime.
I will talk to you later. Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye-bye.